I'm joined by Jonathan Sweeney, who's a colleague of mine here at ECI. Prior to joining ECI, Jonathan's had an extensive executive career as a CEO and COO of listed and unlisted, mainly financial services organizations in Australia. Today he sits on a series and a number of boards as a non-executive director, and he's an absolutely fantastic coach. You, Jonathan, have been also, of course, during your executive career, worked in complex and complicated environments and with teams and developing teams. And so this topic that we're going to be in conversation about today around feedback, I know is one that you had a lot of lived experience and also have done a lot of work and research and thinking about and are incredibly passionate about as well. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation and learning all the ways I can do it better. So there you go. So first of all, thank you for your time today, and let's dive into it. More often than not, when we're in conversation with senior business people, and maybe it's our own lived experience as well, we seem to struggle with giving feedback. There's something about feedback, not the easy feedback, everything's going great sort of feedback, although we might talk about that as well. But the other sort of feedback we often shy away from or avoid or struggle with. So why do we struggle with feedback, do you think?
Yeah, and I think there's two sides to feedback, of course. There's the giving of it and the receiving of it, and some people find it easier to one than the other. Some people struggle with both. Mm-hmm. I think the core of it is it's very emotional. And if it's been done badly in the past, where you've had where you've received feedback that may have been done in a very bad way, those scars stay with you, and that trepidation stays with you. So when you think I'm coming up for feedback again, it's like, oh, is it going to be like last time?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Got a bit of scar tissue.
Yeah, that one hurt. And then when you're giving it as well, of course, if you've had that poor experience at receiving feedback, you're going to go in there with trepidation too, because you don't want to create that environment when you're giving feedback to someone. So I think there's a bit of history.
So we're dealing with the anxiety associated with our sort of learned experience.
Yeah, there's anxiety in there, but also when you're having a serious conversation with people, you want to do it well. So you get a lot of built up tension yourself when you're giving feedback, because the messaging may be there's some good news and there's some not so good news, and we're human beings. We like to be liked, and sometimes giving feedback about things where people can improve can be difficult and can be received badly. So a lot of it is getting over that fear, not only when you're giving it but also when you're receiving feedback, and not getting triggered, that sort of primitive brain coming in where you start to get the tunnel vision and you're not really listening. Even though the messages might be quite good, all you're hearing is the bad news, or you're triggering on the downside. So.
That idea about the primitive brain's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, if the primitive brain is saying, oh, feedback, ooh, this is, how's it going to go? And I'm instantly anxious about it. Well, that's one sort of conversation. And a particular mindset, it's kind of like a defensive mindset. And Absolutely. Yet there's another way to reframe that and go into it with a much different sort of mindset for feedback.
So I think feedback's got to be a conversation. That's how I'd start it. And if you're receiving feedback, try and make it a conversation. And if you're giving feedback, obviously you want a conversation, because you want to understand how the message is landing. You want to make sure it's understood, and both of you then can agree some actions and some points. So you actually do need a conversation. One way is not feedback. Because you also can learn, I believe, whenever I've given feedback, I also walk away with some learnings as well about either my style, how I could have helped someone better, even in my messaging. So it's a really rich opportunity for both people to walk away with a room for improvement or ideas for change.
Well, it's a really interesting idea, isn't it? Which is, if we both go into this thinking that this is an opportunity where we can both get something out of it, we can both win, we can both help each other. I can help you, and in fact, it's my role to help you, and you can help me, and that's your role, is to help me as well. Regardless of the power dynamic, that's a completely different way to.
Yeah, and it is a shift. Yeah, and the shift's got to start, I believe, with the person who's more senior in that relationship. Normally, feedback, there's a power imbalance there. It's usually a senior person to a less senior person. Yeah. Or even more difficult, a less senior person giving feedback upwards. That one can be tricky as well.
So who needs to lead that dance?
I think the senior person has to lead it big time. Yeah. Big time. And that's being open and demonstrating that you're listening.
So herein lies the first problem, it seems to me, which is if I, as you said at the outset, my learned experience is not that, where all the feedback I've had as the senior person has not been this sort of open, helpful, sort of different way of reframing this. So I'm going to have to develop this new way of working, this new habit, this new capability in a way that I haven't been trained or developed in or experienced even. Is that right?
I agree.
So there's a challenge there immediately, surely.
You're right, but the challenge has got to be, again, the mutual benefit, and that's how you solve it. And again, this is really, as I say, it's got to be led by the senior person. And one of the best ways to lead it is to model the behaviour. And what I mean by that is, if a senior person seeks feedback, listens to the feedback, appreciates the feedback, and actually makes change based on the feedback and circles back and shares that change with his team, you're starting to create an environment where people go, oh, actually, this is not harmful, this is not painful, and we are making change. I'd like to make change too, and I'm now doing it in an environment where it will be productive.
So as you know, and as you've experienced and do yourself, we do a lot of 360 reports, developing them, providing that feedback to senior people and so on and so forth. And invariably people say, wow, like this is the feedback I've always wanted, but never really had in the past. Why aren't people getting the real feedback? And yet we have these massive HR systems and processes in place, the biannual performance review, the calibration meetings, the forced rankings, the whatever it is, we've lived it. Why aren't we getting the real feedback?
I think two reasons. One is, in a formal, irregular setting, I'm going to give you a year's feedback in 1 minute. That never works, because you've got to construct the messaging. People do things very well, and there's areas that people can do things better. And if you've got a structured feedback session once a year where you're trying to put all that into one message, and you're going back over a whole year where people may not remember some of the instances you're talking about, it's really difficult. So for me, the starting point is ad hoc, informal, consistent, checking in. Let's not call it feedback, let's call it checking in. How am I going? What are you doing? What are you seeing? Or go to someone, hey Chris, yesterday when you were doing this, I thought that went really, really well. Suddenly you've got a feedback loop happening here that's a positive interaction. It's very, very topical. And you're starting to build that rhythm of feedback that when you tap into it again and again and again, it becomes less and less daunting. And I think that's the starting point. You've just got to make feedback of everything, what you do around here. That's what we do.
So it sounds like what you're saying is, and I completely agree with you, is that fast, frequent, informal, well-intentioned, feedback is impactful. So then what's the role of the formal, right? Because we work in organizations, regardless of the sectors, but many organizations have these big, at least the biannual performance review and the expectations and the anxiety that goes with that. So how does the informal feedback that we've just described interact with the formal?
Yeah. Look, the first thing is no surprises. So if you've had informal, consequential, beautiful feedback throughout a 6-month period, let's say, when you come to the formal review, there should be no surprises in that, because your messaging and the consistency of the approach during that time should have exactly the same result. Except the beauty of the formal feedback, it ties it up into a structure, and it also can tie it up into a development plan. So it can be extraordinarily beneficial. As in, Chris, as we know, during the last 6 months we've been talking about this, here's what I thought we could do, here's the areas I thought we could concentrate in your development. That's a great conversation. Rather than, here's some things I've noticed, and the person who goes, well, gee, I didn't know that. What's going on, right?
It's kind of like the double whammy, isn't it? I always thought, and I think now particularly, that the worst combination is to be surprised and disappointed.
It is.
Right?
Yes.
Like, it's okay for me to be disappointed, but if you layer on surprise onto that, well, that's the double whammy. Now I'm really, I'm out of sorts.
You're at sea, right?
You're at sea.
And all the emotions are going to come out, right?
Yeah.
The anger,
the
embarrassment, maybe even shame. Who knows what it is? These are not healthy.
Above.
These are not healthy, right? So, but if it's a conversation of, hey, what we've been talking about, I've been thinking about this, I'd like to work with you in growing in this area, that's a great conversation. And by the way, in that feedback session, ask the person, is there anything I can do to help you better? What a
Yeah,
great question to
that's
ask.
a great
people.
question to ask. Exactly. Well, it then feels like it's not you and me, and it's not this, it's this.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah?
Exactly right. It's side by side, it's helping each other, because if you're a manager of people, you want your people to thrive, because to be very selfish about it, it makes you look good. It's good for you. Let's be
Well, if
honest.
people
right?
around you are thriving, it's going to help you and them achieve whatever organizational imperatives you're working on.
Exactly right. And also, you want to build your team up. You want to train your team up so they're ready. I call it them pushing you up to the next level. If they're ready to take your job, they're pushing you up to the next level. And that's what you want.
Yeah, no, great.
So it's,
So are there ways that, you know, managers and leaders can make things easier? So we've talked about the sort of mindset shift, you know, the sort of how we're going into this sort of stuff. We've talked about sort of from this to this, but are there other really practical things that you would suggest or you can think of that would make this giving feedback and reducing the anxiety easier?
yeah, there's a couple. There's a process which I'll touch on in a little bit of time, but really the preamble would be to think about the context. If it's important feedback, think about, are we going to do it in my office? Are we going to do it in an open plan? Are we going to do it in a cafe? Are we going to do it on a walk? How do I have an environment that supports the messaging and the feedback?
Great.
How am I going to frame it?
Great, yeah.
Am I going to, if it's a really important message, does it have to be a more formal structure? Can I do it informally?
So does that mean like rehearsed?
Yeah, absolutely. You should be. I think personally, with the big chunks of feedback, certainly with the the formal 6 monthly annual, I would definitely rehearse it.
Okay,
I'd
good.
practice the language and the tone. I'd really be monitoring during the feedback the body language of both. If I'm feeling myself getting a bit upset, I try and dial down. If I see emotional leakage,
So we need to
over
think
here.
about how this works if it's online, because a lot
Yeah.
of this is this, you know,
Really
people doing it
hard.
online. That sounds like a
Really
degree
hard.
of danger.
Look, I think online feedback's difficult. Online feedback, unless it's ad hoc or consequential, which is more in the moment, I think is fine. But if it's more structured, or it's a really important bit of messaging, I think face to
So we
face
got to
is the
be
way
in
to go.
we got to be in each other's space.
I think so.
Okay,
I
good.
think so, because that's how you build the rapport. And the other thing is, I think if you don't have a relationship with someone, it's very hard to give feedback. So I'd encourage everyone to build relationships in the work, which sounds very obvious. But the better the relationships, the deeper the trust and the understanding, the easier the whole feedback process
Trust
goes.
is important, isn't it? You know, and because we can distrust each other's motives.
Totally.
Yeah.
So there are structures. One of the ways I look at it, I call them the 5 W's, and this can help you get some structure. And I personally take comfort in structure because it means I can walk through and make sure I've covered all the areas that the feedback should cover. So feedback should be based on your observations, and it should be timely. So the first 2 is when, there's the time, what I saw or what I felt.
So sorry, when? So when is the? You mean when you noticed X, Y, Z
When the
happening?
event happened,
Okay.
when the behavior
okay.
happened.
So when? Okay. So when is the instance, or what you know? Yeah. When it happened.
And then
yeah.
what I noticed or felt
What
or
you
saw,
noticed. Okay.
and make it from your point of view. Don't speak for other people,
Yeah.
because it's got to be authentically your perception, your
Right.
feeling.
So if I've heard about something from somebody,
Difficult, I think, because then you either have to say, "Oh, Chris told me this," and the person you're saying that to is, "Why didn't Chris bring that up?"
Yeah,
with
yeah.
me?" It gets
Yeah.
murky, right?
Yeah, it does.
It gets
definitely.
murky. So
Okay.
I think it's much better if it's your experience.
Okay.
And then you can talk to it, and it's real. And then the important thing is, once you've got their attention, and you've got to make sure you have their attention, and they understand. You know, when you say, "Oh, yesterday when you're in that meeting," you can
Yeah.
see them going, "Hang on, I was in the meeting. Oh yeah,
Right.
okay, now I know. Now I'm on. You have my attention." Then you're looking now to get their buy-in. So you're saying you get the next part of the W, right, which is what? What is the change? What was the behavior, and what is the change that we are seeking to make?
Okay. So let me just understand this. So when this happened,
Yep.
yeah, what I noticed.
Yep.
Okay. Now you're getting into, and what's the change that you think needs to develop?
Yep. And
Okay.
that's when you start, and this should be really a conversation.
Right.
Is this the change that you think, that we think we should be working towards? And if you start to get the buy-in, you can then say, okay, now we're talking about the change. Well, what are we going to do about it? what's the work we're going to do?
So that's the next one.
And
like a call to action, but what are we going to do?
What
Or what are you going to do? Or
what do we agree to do?
Right.
And then the last one, which unfortunately a lot of people think, oh, that's great, we've given the feedback, off I go. The last one is who? Well, who's going to give you the consistent loop, the consistent feedback? How are you going? Are you doing? Are you making the change? Do you need any more help? Who is going to be that person? And it might be more than one person. To me, this is really important to close it out, because you need that feedback loop, because it's all about continuous improvement.
Yeah, this final step that you mentioned, that fifth element of this, is important because also it creates a bit of role clarity, right? So what are you going to do? What am I going to do? What are we going to do together? How can I help? How can you know, all that sort of stuff. So it creates that clarity, I guess.
It does. And if you break it down to that, it actually makes feedback a lot easier to plan out, to give to someone, because you're giving them context, you're giving the behaviour, you're giving the change, you're seeking agreement and buy-in. So it's not a one-way, it's very much a conversation. And at the end of it, it's okay, basically what are we, the who, what are we going to be doing here to make sure I can continue to help you and you can continue to see feedback on how you're going.
So I can see definitely how those 5 W's, if you will, well, the last one's a who, I guess, but we could rework that one. But anyway, how, I think you said.
No, who.
Who, sorry, beg your pardon. So the 5 W's, quite good, well done. How that can work, particularly in a formal setting. Does it also work in an informal?
Yeah. Again, with an informal setting, you can be a bit looser. So you might only go to the first 3. You mightn't bring it all the way back, because it might be a minor fine tuning of something. So, you know, when and what. What I saw, when did I see that? And then, well, what's the change? And you just leave it there, because it's just so incremental. You don't need to build this, you know, you don't need to build the whole engine, right?
Yeah, right. So in that way, we need to be a little bit sophisticated with exactly how we're applying this sort of idea. Yeah,
and my other counsel will be, don't be a consistent feedback giver, because, you know, whilst feedback's appreciated, I think if you gave someone feedback, you know, 2-3 times a week, it might start to wear them down a bit. So, you know, choose your moments, choose your timing.
Yeah, and at the very beginning, I think you talked about 2-way feedback.
Yeah.
So if there's a vibe about the way we work together, where we give each other feedback.
Yeah, again, if you model the behaviour, you're the more senior person, and I encourage all leaders to actively seek feedback. Because your point in the 360, we do all this stuff, but the 360 is where you get real clarity. Why aren't we getting that clarity every day? And the answer is, we're usually not asking for it. And the second thing is, it's risky for the person to give it to us. So how do we decrease that risk? And the only way you decrease it is to model a receptive listening and learning behaviour when you get the feedback. Is it, Chris, that was fantastic, I'm going to work on this. And then a week later, the leader comes back to Chris and says, hey, this is what I've done. What are you saying? Are you seeing any of this? And that reinforces, Chris goes, oh, that was great. Next time, when I give feedback, I know it's going to be listened to, and I know it's going to be applied.
So if we went to a psychologist and had a fear of something, spiders or fear of whatever, one of the things invariably they'd be working with us on is exposure.
Exactly
Giving us
right.
exposure to the thing we're frightened of.
Exactly right.
And isn't it the same thing with giving and getting feedback? Right?
And also you do it in baby steps too. You wouldn't suddenly plunge your hand into a bucket full of spiders, right? I don't think.
Great point.
I don't think. No. So you do little steps. So the easiest feedback to give, of course, is the positive reinforcing feedback. So maybe start there. Just a little bit of great speech, great presentation. I really like the way you did that. And suddenly you're going to start building that rapport. And seek it yourself.
One of our colleagues, Martin Blake, tells a story about Comanche, that the boat, right, the Super Maxi. And one of the practices that they have as a crew, which is a professional crew of 18 people, I think, something like that. And every time they come off the boat, they do a whip around the boat even before they hit the showers, and they talk about what did we do well. So that's your first point, you know, that positive stuff. And what would be even better if.
Yeah.
And that's all part of the conversation. Everybody gets to go around, and so everybody gets. But that's just the way they roll, right? And that's part of their.
And the language I like, it's a we language.
Yeah.
It's not an I and you language. And this again is feedback's really, really important. Do not, even unintentionally, blame. It's not about the person. It's about the change you're seeking. Do not personalize it. Try and be objective. Try and not let emotions get in the way, because sometimes inadvertently someone gets triggered And then you've got to be very, very careful. You know, you can still have a conversation other than someone, you know, sort of fearing where the whole thing's going and shutting down.
Yeah, or that trigger, that's exactly what happens. That word, it could be just the word, that's it. And triggers and that
I've heard that word before and it wasn't pleasant.
And that conversation's now dead.
Yeah.
And they haven't heard anything else after that.
That's it.
Right.
And it's and be aware of that. And if that happens, my strong suggestion is take a break. Say, hey, Chris, look, let's circle back here. It's, you know, I'd really like to continue the conversation, but it's, you know, we're stalled a bit here, so let's come back. And then maybe when you come back, you can pick up in a less emotional way.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Jonathan, we've talked about lots of different ideas, and we could probably go on and on about feedback. And it really is such an important topic. You know, if I'm a busy executive, I'm under pressure, I've got a lot of demands on my time and my attention, what are the sort of 3 big takeaways you want people to come away from this conversation with?
Look, I mentioned it before, but I think you've got to make it a habit. You've got to embed this in your day-to-day, your week-to-week practices. Okay. Don't wait for every 6 months to give feedback. So firstly, make it a habit and start with small steps. The second one I'd strongly encourage is model it yourself, is seek it first before you give it. And if you do that, again, in a safe way and share it, people become more comfortable with it. And then the third one is prepare. If it's really important feedback, spend the time preparing, maybe even role-playing it, practicing in the mirror, practicing the language you're going to use. Think about the tone, the context, think about where you're going to do it. I think sometimes just a casual walk or going to get a coffee can be a wonderful opportunity to give feedback in a very non-confrontational way.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, listen, thank you. This is such a practical series of ideas that I think we can all use for this. And as a person who regularly gets feedback from you, thank you. Keep going with that.
Thank you. I will always keep giving it.
Now I know. And now I know why you're so good at it.
Thank you, Chris. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Cheers, mate.
Good.